From Chicago's CAN TV, this is Chicago Newsroom.
Welcome to Chicago Newsroom. My name is Kitty Kurth, and I'm filling in for my favorite host, Ken Davis. Things are getting interesting in Chicago these days. The midterm elections are around the corner. Billionaires are battling for governor, and Mayor Rahm Emanuel has said that he won't run for re-election next year. The new mayor, whoever he or she may be, has a lot of work to do. Many say that Chicago is in huge crisis, huge debt, out of control violence, intractable unemployment for some groups. Well, I agree with Mayor Emanuel when he said, never let a crisis go to waste. Today, we're going to talk about taking some of Chicago's biggest problems and turning them into opportunities. Joining me are Howard Lerner, Executive Director of the Environmental Law and Policy Center of the Midwest.
You got it right, Kitty.
And Monica Metzler, Founder and Executive Director of the Illinois Science Council. We'll explore how we can change things in Chicago by looking at environmental issues, which run the gamut from recycling to rail traffic. Maybe we'll throw in a little energy.
Why not?
We'll look at Chicago and how the Chicago and the new mayor can use science and tech sectors to move the city forward. Let's get started. So I'm going to talk about bad things first, and then we'll move on to good. Okay. But Howard, last week, the Better Government Association did a big report on recycling in Chicago. Now, recycling in Chicago, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's something we've been trying to work on for decades, and it seems like we still haven't gotten it right. What do you think about their report and about how we're doing?
You know, I've lived in Chicago neighborhoods for 35 years, and it's frustrating. Mm-hmm. You know, for more than 30 years, we've talked about doing recycling in Chicago, and we can't seem to get it working really good. And there's an opportunity here. This is nothing new these days. Many other cities have, like Chicago, tried some things. They've worked, they've tried some things that didn't work. So let's look forward rather than look backward. What we're doing is not working well, and the BGA report is right on target. I mean, you can pick apart various pieces, but the general point is the system we have now is not working. Here's what our next mayor should do. Look at the other 30 large cities in the United States. Find the 5 that are doing recycling in the very best way. Take those lessons that have been learned, apply them in Chicago. Let's move forward. Let's go from not so good to not just good, but to great. And let's have a first-class recycling program for the city. We have an advantage over other cities. If you go into New York, you'll see all the garbage piled up on the sidewalks.
And you'll smell it.
And you'll smell it. Now, in Chicago, we have alleys.
Why aren't we using
That's
them?
a huge structural advantage. The next mayor and his or her team ought to figure out what are the 5 cities that really do the best job of recycling, take those lessons learned, apply them, and not just go from not so good to good, let's go to great. I'm
going to expand on your premise and say we shouldn't just look in the United States, but look overseas. One of my favorite places that has one of the highest compliance rates uses a stick approach rather than a carrot approach. So in Zurich, you pay way more for garbage bags than you do for recycling bags. So everybody, in order to get around not paying huge amounts of money for their garbage, they've one of the highest recycling rates in the country. Do you think in Chicago we're ready for a stick instead of a carrot?
Well, I think there's a combination of carrots and sticks. The fact of the matter is, you look at what's being done, okay, and I'll accept the amendment because we need to go on a tour of all those great European nation cities that do this. But kidding aside, there's a lot of experience. There are a lot of carrots and sticks that have been used. We ought to figure out what's the greatest hits, make it work for Chicago, apply it in Chicago, and do this really great.
Monica, you work all over Illinois on science and technology issues. Have you seen any great systems?
I would not say that I've seen any great ones, but one thing that I would think about is how are you conveying this to the public? Everybody has a different view of what's recyclable, how do I figure out if it's recyclable, what am I supposed to do with it, does this work, does it not, where do I throw it? And I think that's an important part of it is how do we then communicate this to the public?
I think that's a huge point. I think that's incredibly important because I know even within my own home household, we have discussions about, is that recyclable? Is that not recyclable? And we try to pay attention. And, we try to be on top of it. What about everybody else who has 4,000 other things to worry about?
Exactly.
Speaking of 4,000 other things to worry about, the mayor has, tried to make strides on different things, and one of the big environmental / transportation issues that Mayor Emanuel has been touting is the Elon Musk tube tunnel to O'Hare. I've got 2 questions for both of you. I'm going to go to Monica first. Do you think that it's a good idea? And B, do you think that it will ever be built?
Hard to predict, given the state of our infrastructure, I think right now. I don't deny the idea of thinking big and making grand plans, but I do understand that the devil is in the details in something like this. So I think it has potential, but it requires a lot of study to figure out all the aspects of this, not just the financing, but how's it going to disrupt neighborhoods? Is it going to really improve? Is it the best bang for our buck in improving the infrastructure and the transportation system that Chicago has and needs to have vis-a-vis O'Hare?
I completely agree. And are there other things that we could do that would not only improve transportation to O'Hare, but also improve transportation elsewhere? Plus, I remember back when we started building, well, I don't remember, but I've read about when we started building skyscrapers and they started sinking pylons. And guess what? Underneath Chicago, it's all water. How much is it going to cost to pump out the tunnels and to keep them free of water? Howard, same question to you. Do you think it's a good idea? And do you think it'll ever be built?
Okay, what's a good idea is finding a way for people to get from O'Hare to downtown quickly, efficiently, reasonably, and fairly easily. I mean, the fact of the matter is we're becoming a center for tourism that's helping our economy. We're becoming a center for corporate headquarters, both global and national. Kudos to Mayor Emanuel and World Business Chicago. They've really done an excellent job on that. The trick is, how do you get people more quickly and easily from the airport to downtown and the reverse? So that's a good idea. Then the question is this the right tool to get it done? And the jury's out on that. It's an engineering question, as Monica said. It's a finance question. It's a practical question. When you are drilling around Chicago neighborhoods on the northwest side, what happens?
Those unintended consequences.
Right. Is there really enough money to do this? We've gone through the Spire project, which was 1% complete and a hole in the ground. It's one thing for Mr. Musk to say, my money's at risk, but if it turns out to be much more expensive than anticipated and it's 2% complete, what do we do next?
Right.
So jury's
or worse
out.
Yet, it's 70% complete, but there's still a huge
funding
budget
disappears
tag,
or
and
something.
what happens?
So idea, it's good, and we want the city to be ambitious in terms of exploring things. Let's see, there are serious people at the city like the Deputy Mayor, Bob Rifkin, who are looking at this. Bob's a smart, serious guy. Let's see what they find in terms of engineering, in terms of costs, and whether when you get from concept down to a sharpened pencil, as Monica put it, it really pencils out.
And it always amazes me that we have some other tools in our toolbox ready to go that could be deployed much more economically that people don't look at. For example, there is a train right now that goes from Union Station to O'Hare, and you hop on a little bus and it takes you right to the station. It's part of Metra. I take it because I take that line further on to Antioch, so I know about it. But it shocks me that no one knows that there's actually a train, not the blue line, that you can take to O'Hare.
Well, and there's also the blue line, which is good,
Right.
but there's problems in terms
But it bothers
of the blue
me
line.
that Metra has this asset that they don't talk about, that they don't communicate to the public. Like we were saying about recycling, you know, Metra doesn't say, gee, you can take the train from Union Station to O'Hare, you know, sit in comfort and style, relatively speaking. And it just amazes me that they don't use it more.
Well, this is your question about, is this a good idea? And that's why I was saying the purpose is a good idea. We need to find a way or ways in which people can get more quickly, efficiently, reasonably from O'Hare to downtown and back and forth. But it's not one tool. Lots of tools in the toolbox.
And don't forget about reasonably. In Stockholm, they have a wonderful high-speed train from the airport into downtown Stockholm, but they found that a lot of the people that take it are tourists and people visiting, because the local people realize they can take the train that runs right alongside of it for about half the price and make 2 stops and take it in 30 minutes instead of 20 minutes, because they've sort of outpriced themselves on the high-speed rail. Well, switching gears a little bit, and Howard, you and I have had this conversation privately, but I believe that setting a good example as a sustainable environmental city can provide opportunities to Chicago, both for tourism and for people wanting to come here. People want to come here anyway because they know that it's cleaner than New York, and we don't have our garbage out on the streets. But let's talk about a little bit about how environmental ideas and sustainability can grow our economy.
Well, first of all, we talk all the time about having environmental progress and economic growth together. We can have them both. They're not in conflict. You know, when we develop clean energy in this city, it's good for the environment, it creates jobs, it's good for the economy. And it's what people want. If you look at the polling data and so forth, when it comes to solar energy, when it comes to energy efficiency, that cuts across all gender lines, racial lines, age. Everybody supports and wants to see the city and wants to see the utilities doing more. Mayor Emanuel led the Chicago Climate Summit last December. 50, 60 cities were here. We were the leaders in what was called the Chicago Climate Charter. Well, leaders step up and lead. You know, we need to take that leadership and make sure that the city does indeed move forward with what it's now planning. 100% renewable energy to meet the city's needs. We ought to be looking at electric vehicles to be the fleet purchases for the future. Over time, they save costs, they reduce pollution, they're good for the environment, and they get us on the cutting edge. We ought to be really bullish when it comes to energy efficiency. Let's stop wasting money, okay? It's time to be more energy efficient in the future. That saves money, creates jobs, and reduces pollution. So what you get is good for jobs, good for economic growth, good for the environment. It all fits together. The city should be a leader on that. We, like other cities around the country, are fighting to get, you know, bright, new, talented, younger people into our city. And Chicago's been pretty successful at that. Those folks are very green. They're looking to see how sustainable a city is. When we do that, it helps our recruiting of both businesses and that next generation of talent.
Let's talk about kids for a minute. And by kids, I mean kids writ large. Basically anyone under 50,
you know,
which to me is a kid. But, you know,
it's all matter of perspective, Kitty.
We do want to attract those people, and many of them may be working in the tech sector and the science sector. Are there some ideas that you might have for the next mayor about some things that we could use to keep bringing people to Chicago and to sort of stop the exodus?
I absolutely do. One of my concerns is that this idea that, oh, if we want to keep all these smart computer science and engineering grads from the universities here, you know, and the mayor takes them to Lollapalooza, you know, and improv shows. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think that is great.
Lollapalooza and improv shows have their place.
Right.
Don't write about Lollapalooza and improv shows. We love improv.
Yeah, they are, you know, our arts and culture sector is phenomenal. But my view has always been, what are we doing to promote our science sector? Not just the tech sector, meaning, the great assets that we have now in places like 1871 as a tech incubator and Matter in Healthcare and M-Hub and those things, but the science sector. Chicago is home to 6, count them, 6 science museums, not 1 but 2 national laboratories. There are only 17 national labs in the country. We've got 2 of them in our backyard with Argonne Lab and Fermilab. It's extraordinary. We have 2 internationally recognized zoos, both engaged in conservation research, 5 major medical centers, and 4 botanic gardens and conservatory type things. This is an extraordinary breadth and depth of science research that goes on in this town. And that's not even talking about the companies. And we're not just talking about the startups. We're talking about major multinationals, Boeing, Motorola, Abbott, Baxter. I mean, this is science research going on in this town. But nobody talks about our science sector. It's all about our arts and culture sector. So I think that's a piece that if the new mayor with the megaphone that he or she will have, I think that is an asset that the ones touting our city to new businesses and to keep graduates here should be talking up more.
Do you think that the science sector writ large, do you think they do a good enough job of talking to one another?
Perhaps not. I think what happens, and this is just part and parcel of the nature of what goes on in science research. Science, the more we learn, the narrower it gets. So the fields, the physics are really, it's not physics large, it's particle physics, theoretical physics, this sort of thing. In any field, in life sciences, they're going to get narrower and narrower. And they will, by their nature, to do research, to learn more, to develop new things that lead to all these wonderful inventions and advancements that we are the beneficiaries of. They, by their nature, have to talk amongst themselves. But there's been this wonderful growth in the last 10 years of the science community doing more outreach. And that's what my organization is about, is serving as that sort of communication link from the science community to the public to share all this amazing, incredible stuff that's out there. And so I think there's that, but there is an awful lot of interdependence and interrelated work that goes on. Argonne and Fermi, the researchers there are also the researchers at Northwestern and University of Chicago and University of Illinois at Chicago. They have all these cross appointments, same things with the museums, the Field Museum, the Adler, the Planetarium. They have actual scientists, PhD researchers on staff. They're not just science centers. 4 out of our 6 science museums have PhD researchers on staff, huge collections that are used by researchers around the world. Researchers come here because of the work that goes on. So in that sense, Chicago is a draw for this, but most of us, aren't thinking about that.
How much do you think kids who are in high school now and are STEM students or STEAM students, science, tech, engineering, arts, and math, how much do you think that students realize that there are opportunities for them to stay after they graduate from college? And do we do enough to let them know?
I would argue there's never enough. I know that those institutions have their own education departments that are all trying to do that sort of outreach. But in my view, I think typically the outreach efforts and frankly the funding from corporate foundations, private foundations, all of that has been very focused on K through 12, in particular the 8 to 13-year-olds. It's this middle school age at which kids start to lose their interest in math and science.
After they blow up the first lab at elementary school.
Yeah, something like that.
It all kind of went downhill for me from there.
There you go. But so I think there's a great importance to do that. But when you fixate on that, you are missing 85% of the public. And that's the public that has the most influence on those kids. This idea I encounter all the time that people think science outreach equals kids. STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, as if it's a kid thing and not just an acronym for an industry.
Right.
And so my view is if we can do a better job of conveying this to that other 85% of the public, the 70% of the households who do not have a child under 18, we will do better in letting all those students who may be interested in that be aware of all the opportunities that exist in and around the Chicago region.
One of the things that always surprises me, and I don't think anybody except Howard and 3 other people and I know about, is Chicago is a real center for wind technology and for innovation in wind technology, right? Can you?
You know what? It used to be it was you and me and 3 people who knew that. Then it became 13, then it became 30, and now, Kitty, we're probably at well beyond that. Hundreds of people. Here's why. There are 13 wind power companies that have their global or North American headquarters in Chicago or the surrounding
13.
suburbs. 13.
That's amazing.
It's the largest concentration of anywhere in the United States. And
so
probably
the
in
Windy
the world.
City really is the Windy City
We
now,
are.
finally?
And some of them
I
are
love that we can recapture that
Yes.
name when I
We-
constantly have
we're-
to explain to
We're putting it into a good
tourists.
context.
Right.
Some of them are homegrown companies. Invenergy, for example, that Michael Polsky leads as CEO, is a Chicago company that operates nationally, and the corporate headquarters are here. Some of them are companies like Suzlon, which is an Indian company, companies like Acciona, which is from Portugal, Spain, and they have their North American headquarters here. So you say, okay, why is this happening? And it's a combination of really good factors. First, once there were a couple of them here, then others said, maybe that's a good place to
Let's
join
take
it.
a look.
Let's take a look, and maybe somebody has a deputy CFO that I could hire away to be my CFO.
And he already knows the industry.
And knows the people.
He won't have to move.
Secondly, Chicago's a great city to live. And it's a city that's attractive to people coming in for culture. It's attractive for, as a place to be. It's a happening place. Younger, talented people want to come here. Third, if you are a European or Asian company and you have your headquarters here, O'Hare's a real asset. You can fly in and out back to
Wherever.
Spain or Portugal. You can fly back and forth to Germany. You can fly to China. You can fly to India. More fundamentally, the Midwest is, if you will, the Saudi Arabia of wind power. And there are projects all over Iowa, Illinois, South Dakota, Minnesota, North Dakota. And if you're here in Chicago and you want to go see your project or see some of the people you need to deal with in South Dakota, you can fly nonstop to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, 4 to 5 times a day. So it's a very, very good place to do business because of the air service, because of the talent pool, because of the central location, and one built on another. And this is the fast-growing sector here in the Chicago economy. Solar companies are now coming in, and part of it is because of those factors, and part of it is because we got the policies right here in Illinois.
That's what I was just going to ask. What have we done right in the wind energy sector that we can replicate and use to attract solar energy, to attract other kinds of businesses? What have we done right, and what things can we do even better? And third,
Go for it.
are we leveraging the success that we've had in the wind sector? Are we talking about that enough to companies outside, to companies in Europe, to companies around the country that we're trying to attract?
All right, as a lawyer, I'll say you asked a compound question,
Yes,
so I'll give
I
you a
did.
compound answer. To take them in reverse, we can never do enough about touting how we're a clean energy center and trying to attract more of the fastest growing sector in the business world, the clean energy business. We want to be the center of the clean energy economy. That's highly competitive. There are a lot of cities competing for us, so we want to get the word out of where we are successful. What's the single thing we've done that's driven most of it? Policy. The fact of the matter is we got a renewable energy standard right in Illinois that helped spur the development of wind power around the state. The result of that was Illinois.
When was that, Howard?
It began in 1997, then it got upticked in 2007. And when we got that passed, and the Environmental Law and Policy Center, the wind industry, and a number of our environmental group colleagues played a key role in getting it done. But what that did, when we passed it in 2007, is it spurred aggressive wind power development in Illinois. we became the number 4 state in the country. Think about it. If 20 years ago we had said Illinois is going to be number 4 or 5, the numbers toggle back and forth every few months.
Yep.
But we're going to be in the top half dozen states wind power nationally. People would have made jokes about the windy city and so forth. Fact is, good for jobs, good for economic growth, good for the environment. Corporate jobs, technical jobs, legal jobs, financing jobs in Chicago, construction jobs, union worker scale, in central Illinois and southern Illinois where it really rocks. Here's what's happening on solar. We're getting the
Let's come back to solar.
Solar comes next.
Well, I just
to
wanted
Monica.
to chime in, no, for both of those.
Yeah.
I would also say that's where this asset comes in for this research. Argonne Lab is involved in so many of these areas. The material science sector that goes on at places like Argonne Labs at Northwestern. This is a very fast developing area that needs newer, better technologies so that it can get to the scale that we can start developing these businesses faster. So let's leverage this and all these great engineering schools that we have in our region.
Absolutely. And the reason why I asked you about, when did you start? Because I remember how long ago it was that we started. And it's something that's key. It's long term. We need to start planting the seeds now for economic development that might not happen for 20 years. For anybody running for mayor, they're thinking of 6 months and 1 year. So I think as policy people, which you guys are, we need to think about ways to educate all of the 35,000 people running for mayor. That's not quite true. There aren't 35,000, but there could be 35. But we need to think about educating them about things that have to happen within Chicago that have a longer term timeline. And they're not going to get all the benefits within the first couple of years. But I want to take host prerogative and tell a story about wind energy. We were working on helping to site a wind farm up actually next to the Horicon Marsh in Wisconsin. And the first lesson I learned was you can't just look on a map, you have to go look in person, because I was really worried about having a wind farm next to a bird sanctuary. I was like, how can I be for that? But then when I drove up there, I found out that there's a 1,000-foot cliff between where the turbines would be built and the marsh, and then the turbines are another 400 feet on top of the 1,000 feet. So I realized that birds are smarter. They're going down to the marsh to eat. They're not interested in. But when we went there, we tried to figure out who else in the community would benefit from this and who did we need to network with. We talked to the farmers. Obviously, they're going to benefit from having the turbines on their land. Then we went to the people in the community who would benefit because the farmers were going to have money. Then we realized there was a construction company headquartered right nearby. And being a lefty democratic socialist, I first went to the unions to talk to them and said, would you come with me to talk to the company so that we can talk to them about growing jobs and how we should all be for this because it's going to grow jobs. Well, it worked extraordinarily well. The construction company had never built wind turbines before, but they said, we've got this skill, we've got that skill, we can do this. Now, flash forward probably 10 years later, building wind turbines is one of that company's biggest lines of revenue. And, it almost didn't happen except that we were communicating. And I wanted to bring that back to, because this is the point that I think any mayoral candidate, any aldermanic candidate, of which there are about 110,000, this is the point that they all need to hear, is communication. Talk not only to your constituents, but to the businesses, talk to the policy sector. And I feel like what you talked about with the wind sector, what you talked about with the science sector, if we were all communicating, Chicago could be moving forward a lot more. And we are going to get back to solar energy, but I also wanted to talk about Trump Tower.
Let me connect all three of those first for you.
Because and we'll come back to Trump.
I can just put them all together for you.
Perfect.
So wind power, the largest U.S. wind manufacturer, GE Wind Power, now headquartered in Chicago. Okay? So look at it. There are now
How do I
5.
not know that? And how have I not been seeing
And-
that on television
and that-
in the newspaper
bingo.
every day?
And we all
'Cause
should
nobody's
be
covering
communicating
it.
better on that
Exactly.
and better
We're gonna
coverage
get
on
to
that.
that.
I told you I was going to connect your points.
Perfect.
Okay. Secondly, there are now 500 businesses in Chicago, in Illinois, excuse me. The Environmental Law and Policy Center did our clean energy supply chain study. 500 businesses in Illinois in the wind, solar, and geothermal supply chain. You know, some of those are corporate headquarters jobs, financial, legal. Some of them are construction jobs. Some are the people who lay the concrete. Some are manufacturing jobs, companies that make equipment. Put it together, 500 companies, well over 10,000 jobs. That's, as our president would say, huge for the state of Illinois. Solar is booming. We got the policy right. A year and a half ago, we passed the Future Energy Jobs Act, which has a really strong renewable energy component. The success has many mothers and fathers of invention. Environmental Law and Policy Center, our environmental colleagues, solar energy businesses, low-income community groups work together. 3,000 megawatts of solar. Let me translate 3,000 megawatts
How
of
many
solar. What's that
households?
mean?
What does that mean?
You know what that means? It means 10 million solar panels when you put that all together. It is a huge number of solar panels being installed. And that's jobs, that's clean energy. But
All
here's
around Illinois, the
in
region,
Illinois,
Chicago.
in Illinois. So here's what that means. When we convene a meeting of solar companies, and they're all flocking to Illinois now because we're driving the market. We're putting out RFPs calling for about 3,000 megawatts of solar over the next several years. A couple months ago, there were about 60 different solar companies in the LPC's conference room. They're here to play. Some of them have been here for a while. Some of them are new. Ranger Power is doing projects in Illinois. That's new. Solar Services, they've been around for a long time. Their business is growing. Sunrun, a big residential solar installer, is now here in Illinois, and they're looking to hire almost 100 people. So, I mean, this is a boom. The policy drives markets. The technology is getting better. And as Monica said, to sort of close the loop, solar plus energy storage is a game changer. Argonne is doing some of the very best battery storage research in the country.
Is enormous.
George
critical.
Crabtree, who runs what's called the J. Caesar program, the Joint Center for Energy Storage, is absolutely terrific. He and his colleagues are close partners because if we can put together solar plus storage, not only does Chicago and Illinois rock, but Monica's point, Argonne is the national center for that work. We really rock.
Let me talk about policy again. And
Go for it.
Well, how
I'm a
are
policy guy.
No,
Yeah.
are the elected officials at the state level and at the municipal level, are they doing what they need to do to help us build solar in the way that we've built the wind industry?
I think
Huge-
one of the
go ahead.
challenges I was going to say about whenever you're talking about the policymakers, and it applies to the aldermen, as you were saying, is that by its nature, they're concerned about their ward, their city. So when you look at things that technically Northwestern University is not in Chicago city limits, nor is Fermilab, nor is Argonne. But if we can get them, and same thing with state legislatures, and you can understand the pressures that they're under to think about that way in who they represent. But if you can start thinking about the region and the assets of the region, because it does all connect and interplay wherever a corporate headquarters is located, in the city limits, in the county, that sort of thing. That's where I think we get the real benefit, is for all of us to start thinking more broadly about these things.
I agree, and if I had 3 minutes with the next new mayor, whoever he or she might be, I would talk to them about stop thinking parochially and think regionally. I think one of the biggest problems with O'Hare, every Chicago mayor has been so focused on, O'Hare is part of Chicago, I need O'Hare to be part of Chicago, that the Western access has been stalled and not been a priority. And I think as climate change moves forward, we need the Western access in a very micro way that nobody's looking at, but getting to O'Hare in a bad rainstorm, the blue line floods and you can't get there on the blue line. the viaducts flood and you can't get there, you literally can't get through the tunnel. Then when you get to the parking lots flood. Well, guess what? We only have one access to the airport. Perhaps moving forward, knowing that rain is only going to get worse and there's only going to be more storms, maybe just for climate reasons, we should have the western access, not to mention the economic growth that it would bring to the whole region and the fact that everyone in the far western and northwestern suburbs would suddenly be able to get to O'Hare in 5 minutes instead of 35 by having to go all the way around. And they wouldn't be in their cars as long, and there would be less
Do you have a point of view on this, Kitty?
You know, and seriously, it's just because I spend a lot of time at O'Hare, and I've been to O'Hare when everything is flooded, and I'm at O'Hare and I can't get home. And no one can get there to pick me up either. But
yeah, I think there's this aspect of looking at all of these issues. And as you said earlier, how do we do it for a long-term thing? And that is a challenge for politicians who are thinking short-term, my next election, for companies that are concerned about this quarter and the pressure that they all have. So how can we rise above those inherent pressures that are the nature of the system to start thinking more broadly and more long-term?
And I think that's where the citizens of Chicago, everybody listening and watching this show, as a citizen advocate, I mean, you want Chicago to have more jobs so that we can all pay less taxes collectively. You know, we want a thriving economy. And if people are telling their elected officials, we need a 20-year plan, we need a 10-year plan, maybe they'll start to listen in ways that they haven't. When you talked about battery storage, it also hit a nerve because there was a big collaboration between Sweden and Argonne years ago. It was Argonne, I hope it wasn't Fermi. Battery storage?
That would be Argonne.
Argonne, right?
Argonne.
Okay, sorry. But there was a big collaboration probably 20 years ago now where they were making huge strides on battery storage, Sweden and the US together, and then Argonne had to drop out because the federal administration changed and the funding got cut. So it puts us 20 years behind everyone else in the world. How can we compete economically if...
And I think those funding flows do add to the challenge. And this long-term thing is really at the heart of doing basic science research. It is hard for all of us to grasp the value of spending money, sometimes large amounts of money, on research that we do not know where it will lead to. So to say, well, how is this going to be helpful tomorrow? How is it going to fix my cell phone battery today? Is a hard thing to say. No, we're looking at basic science research principles that are going on. And that's the stuff that is hard to predict. The work that went on at Fermilab decades ago, is now used in proton therapy for cancer. You end up with so many of these challenges.
Medical research that happened 30 years ago is now bearing fruit. I completely get it. And we've gone this long and we haven't talked about Trump. So because we're having such a nice discussion, I'm going to upset
because we care about
everything.
Chicago.
But
yes.
I want to talk about Trump Tower specifically. And I want to talk about the hot water, not the hot air, coming out of Trump Tower. In other cities like Rotterdam and many places in Europe, they're taking that hot water waste and instead of dumping it into the river where it's polluting everything and killing fish, they're using it for heating, for steam. They're using the steam to do heating. Is there any way that we can get Chicago to move forward on taking what is currently a waste product, the hot water generated by manufacturing, and turn it into a product, turn it into an opportunity?
Okay. So first of all, the Trump Tower problem isn't a manufacturing problem.
No, it's a...
The allegation is that the Trump Tower, the building itself, the developers and the operators are not complying with the law when it comes to wastewater they're releasing into the Chicago River, discharging it. And that's wrong.
And
if they aren't...
In case of any building,
how
if
many
they're doing
degrees too hot?
If they're not complying with the law, darn it, they should do that. They should fix it. And if there are some innovative uses by which they can tap the hotter water, that's a good thing. But baseline, the Clean Water Act, cleaning up the Chicago River, keeping our lakefront clean, that's in Chicago not a negotiable issue.
Right.
You got to comply with the law and you got to do it well. So the obligation of Trump Tower, if the allegations are correct, is to get in compliance with the law so we can protect our river. So you asked what the next mayor should do or can do. Here are 3 quick things. One of them relates to Trump. While President Trump is stepping back in terms of the clean air enforcement, keeping our water safe and clean and drinkable, stepping away from clean energy development, the city ought to step up. The next mayor ought to take what we committed to do in the Chicago Climate Charter. Whatever Mayor Emanuel isn't able to get done, we shouldn't let him off the hook. He's still the mayor. He should try to get this stuff done while he's still in office. But the next mayor ought to make sure that we are on 100% renewable energy, some of which comes from Chicago and some of which may come, as you pointed out, from other parts of the state or around the region. Let's bring in others, get it done. We ought to be moving toward electric vehicles, both in terms of charging stations, and those charging stations ought to be open to the public, and they ought to be powered by clean energy. So we're not trading carbon for carbon by having a clean car that's powered with fossil.
Right.
You know, no carbon for carbon, clean energy, energy charging stations for electric vehicles, where the city, for its new fleet purchases, buys electric vehicles, helps drive the market. And in our neighborhoods and our city buildings, let's make them energy efficient so we avoid wasting electricity, we save money, we avoid pollution. The next mayor ought to prioritize doing what the city is already committed to do. Rome isn't built in a day. Mayor Emanuel is taking some good steps. The next mayor needs to bring that one home. Secondly, next mayor ought to make sure that with regard to the Chicago River, with regard to Lake Michigan, that we're keeping them clean. They've been getting better. Lake Michigan is much better. The Chicago River, shall we say, if we were a kid, our report card would say needs improvement.
Yeah.
We're
going to talk about general iron
We
in a
need
minute,
to
too.
keep improving the Chicago River. Everybody in the city cares about that, and the lakefront, it's where we live, it's where we work, it's where we play. Let's make it better. And the third thing that the mayor ought to be doing is saying, what is Trump doing that is just wrong for us? And as Mayor Emanuel's been doing, how do we fight back on that? And that includes issues involving immigration. It involves issues regarding clean air, clean water, healthy communities for the city of Chicago. That's what our next mayor ought to be doing on those separate fronts. And I think those are things that our next mayor can do.
Monica, I'm going to open it up. I want you to talk about the next mayor, but we also have a governor who's going to be elected in November. Things that we're doing right, things that we're doing wrong, advice you would give to the next governor or the next mayor, go broad.
Well, I was going to say, just following up on his point, the changes that are happening at the EPA and this idea that we're not basing our policies on the best science available, that's where we start losing at the national level and the city level. The development of the EPA was about using the best research available so that we did clean up Lake Michigan, cleaning up the Chicago River, and we all know the benefit of doing that sort of thing. So I think the point is to make sure that all policies at the federal level, at the state level, which relates to all sorts of, we're an agricultural state.
Yes.
Chicagoans don't think about, but we're an ag state. So using all the best agricultural research that's going on in all our state universities that relate to this, the research that's going on about battery storage, how it's relating the material science to all the renewable energy aspects. So my take for both of those is to say, what do we have, what do we know now that's the best way to run something, to do something, to build a company on for the future, is to say, what are the policies that we can create on that front? Speaking to the governor, there used to be a scientific advisor to the governor many decades ago that sort of disappeared. My point would be there's a very large and exceedingly well-funded Chicago Department of Cultural Affairs. Why is there not a Chicago Department of Science Affairs?
Is there a science advisor to the mayor? I'm guessing no, right? Okay.
No. And this would be my take, is if the city and the state are spending our tax dollars, and I'm not disputing the value of this, to promote the arts through the Illinois Arts Council, through the Chicago Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events,
Yep.
to say they are fabulous assets, they are attractive, they make Chicago attractive to
make
businesses, to tourists and all that. Why are we not doing the same for science and tech? Why do we not have that megaphone to share that with the public, to make sure that people understand that, and those entities that are trying to recruit new businesses from a governor or the mayor's level to do that sort of thing?
That's exactly why we're having this discussion today, because as a citizen of Chicago, and a pretty active one, I've watched the Chicago Board of Trade and the Options Exchange and the Mercantile Exchange, their business models changed. And all those people who were employed in those industries, the number has shrunk drastically, and the economic impact to the city has shrunk drastically. And we have to be about trying to find new ways to bring people here and to put people to work, or we're going to be okay. I have another radical idea I want to ask you about. What if we as citizens, or you as policymakers, threw down the gauntlet to the next mayor that we would, for example, have a science, environment, technology summit next summer after the new mayor is elected and the new governor is elected, and make them both come and talk to one another? What do you think?
You know
Fabulous.
what? Summits are good. Okay, I think that Chicago hosting the climate summit in December of 2017 was a really good thing. It brought a lot of attention.
Did
It
the
focused
mayors
the public.
talk to one another and
The mayors talked
listen
to
to one another?
The mayors talked with each other. They listened. They shared good ideas. The public was invited. It was a good event, and I mean that.
But
the
I'm-
proof that
I'm sensing a but.
and there's a
Question
but,
is, what
but it's
comes
more
after?
it's more of an and. And after, I'm much more of an and guy than
Okay, okay.
what can I say, than a
Than
but
a but
guy.
guy? Okay,
yeah, I
great.
don't know how that plays out in the world these days, but I'm an and guy. The and is, after you have the big event, do you take the things that people saw as being the best ideas that the city, the mayor's committed to, and then do the hard work of actually getting them done? So on the one hand, the summit focuses attention, and it's your point about communications, engaging the public, engaging other mayors. But then you got to do the blocking and tackling and really make sure that the great ideas that came out, you actually implement them. So it's a both and. Let's make sure we have a little bit of circuses to attract interest, communicate, engage the public, but then let's really make sure that we're taking that and implementing that in ways that make a difference.
But somebody said once about festivals, and Chicago's the city of festivals. It's great when you have that festival because you get a lot of attention and the media might actually cover it, but then nobody thinks about you for 51 weeks of the year. Well, that's not what you want.
Right.
And it's the same thing, and we run the Chicago Science Festival in May, but we're doing things year round. You can have your conference, your summit, but let's make sure, as you're saying, let's make sure that we're communicating this consistently and doing the work throughout the rest of the year.
I have this crazy notion that the mayor of the largest city in Illinois and the governor of the state of Illinois should maybe get together once a month without cameras, privately, have an agenda. Here's all the things that we need to get done. Here's all the industries we need to make sure we're talking to. I have this crazy notion that might actually move things forward and help, and even help on the really big problems that we're not talking about today, violence and education, because I'm not smart enough to talk about solutions to any of that. It's beyond me. But
Kitty, something that Mayor Daley did that I thought was really smart.
Mayor Daley number 1 or number 2?
Mayor Daley number 2, who
Just
was mayor
checking.
who was mayor while I was living in the city. you hear all the downstate mayors and downstate legislators carping about Chicago, about everything goes to Chicago, and it's sort of popular downstate to beat up on Chicago. What Mayor Daley did was he invited all the legislators, senators, representatives, and bring their spouses, come to Chicago for a weekend. They toured some of the great museums. They went to a sports event. They went to some of the museums. They ate great pizza. They had Eli's cheesecake. And you know what? They all came. They had a fun time. And after they've all been in Chicago and they've all enjoyed Chicago, it's just a little bit harder for them to go back home and say, Chicago's that horrible place where my spouse and I were just over last weekend having a really good time.
And it makes it a little harder to vote against the legislation that the mayor needed to pass. But
it built bridges. And what the point of this is, it's about the governor, as you're saying. It's also about 177 legislators, some of whom are from Chicago. A lot of them are from small towns like Mattoon, Depew, and other places. They like coming to the biggest city in the state. They love coming to Chicago. Treat them well, treat them with respect, engage with them. The mayor was right on that, and I think it paid a lot of dividends.
It wouldn't hurt to make the Chicago folks
go
spend
to
some time in Central and Southern Illinois as well.
You are one step ahead of me, both of you.
Exactly. Going on down there.
But why Mayor Daley knew that was people forget. He was a legislator at the beginning of his career. He was down in Springfield. He met those people from around the states. This kind of is on my other high horse about how people generally just need to talk to people more, whether it's Chicago talking to Illinois or Illinois talking to Montana or the U.S. talking to people in the EU, or, the more you talk, the more you communicate, you find out there's all these great ideas out there. Maybe we should be, every idea doesn't have to be our original idea in Chicago. Maybe we could steal some and make them better.
Well, that's, to bring closure to this, that's where we start on recycling, right? What the next mayor should do is ask his or her policy advisor, some senior staff person, you look at the 30 largest cities in this country, look at what they've done on recycling, look what's worked well, let's work at what hasn't worked well. Put together the greatest hits and come back to me and say, if Chicago wants to be not just going from not so good to okay, we want to go to great, from fair to great. And what's the greatest hits? What can we do? What are the lessons learned? Let's take those and apply them here. And
more importantly, let's also, even though recycling isn't rocket scientists, let's talk to the rocket scientists and to the other scientists and say, what are the things that we're not doing? In Sweden, I know, I hate to keep bringing in Sweden, but in Sweden, they incinerate their garbage and then use the heat, use it as other byproducts. There's so many things that if we talk to the scientists.
I think that's part of it. I also just want to add the point about the notion that Chicago is a global city, and we know this, but certain people constantly trying to tout that in different ways. One of my frustrations some years ago when they were hosting it was all about, let's talk about our restaurants. I mean, we love it, but the science community, the whole field of science is inherently international. You cannot throw a stone at one of these universities or the labs without getting somebody who is currently doing international partnerships in their work. So there's an easy and quick linkage to all these other potentials and opportunities in Asia, in Europe, all over the world that we could do a better job of tapping into.
And I think part of it is we need to educate not only the people, but we need to educate the new governor, the new mayor,
policymakers,
the new aldermen. We need to educate them about the fact that, it's not a zero-sum game. Chicago can gain and work with other cities and learn from them. We don't have to go it alone. Recycling. We're coming back to recycling, but a slightly different take.
Sure.
Up on the north side, on the river, there's a company called General Iron, which does scrap recycling. Valuable job, somebody's got to do it. But right now, the community around them is changing. It used to be an industrial community. It's now going to be more of a residential and retail community. They are under rules from the EPA that there was a big squawk in city council a couple weeks ago because they there was a injunctions saying they had to limit, or not an injunction, sorry, that's the wrong word, but they were supposed to limit their hours. And the alderman representing the ward was trying to get them to comply with this. And the mayor and many other aldermen who perhaps have taken campaign contributions didn't think that this was necessary. How can we make sure that not only are the EPA regulations there, but that our elected officials enforce them?
All right. First of all, compliance with the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the environmental standards is not voluntary.
Right.
That's the rules of the road, okay?
Right.
You ought to know those
Whether
going
you're
into your
operating
business.
on the northwest side or the south side or the west side or the far north side of the city, you comply if you're running a good business with the environmental and the public health laws. That's a given. It's not optional, it's not voluntary. And if a company isn't doing it, the city or the state attorney general or the US EPA ought to implement and enforce those standards, right? And if they don't do it, from time to time, groups like ours, the Environmental Law and Policy Center with public interest attorneys, step in to enforce. The General Iron situation is complicated in one way, not complicated in another way. The way it's not complicated is if General Iron or any other company has not been complying with the environmental and the public health laws, they ought to be required to do it, period. That's a given.
So how can we back up Alderman Hopkins and give him a little help in trying to get them to comply?
Well, the bigger question is, how do you develop compatible land uses in a city like Chicago where, I get it, people who live around a scrap facility don't like the noise and the dust and so forth that comes from it, and the scrap facility says, we've invested in our business, we're here, we've been doing business. So number one, you comply with the laws. Period. No ifs, no buts. With regard to how do you mediate between the two of those, we got to be better about zoning, both looking forward and looking backward. The problem here is we had an area that was zoned for industrial. There's a lot of residential development that sprung up around it.
Changing.
And that's very, very hard to reconcile.
And it's also, it was zoned manufacturing, they've rezoned it. So what I'm hearing is we need leadership, but we need enforcement. We're wrapping up. Is there anything else that you think that should be on the agenda for the city, the state, for all of us in the next short term, long term?
Okay.
Monica?
Go ahead.
Well, my take is simply that. It's that earlier notion of making sure that you're thinking about Chicago at large, thinking about the region, thinking about the assets that we have to bring to bear on some of the real challenges and the problems that we have, and not ignoring some of those assets that I would argue is one of the challenges with the science sector in particular.
Howard?
For Chicago to be a great city and attracting strong talent and keeping people who want to live here and living well, we have to be a green city. And if we're going to be a green city, we need to have a green, workable, strong public transit system. The fact of the matter is, no good public transit, no green city. A great city has to have very, very good public transit.
Next time, we're going to talk more about
Deal.
transit,
You're
because we
on.
didn't get to today.
All righty.
And we're going to talk about how to make the newspapers and the media talk more about science and environment. Thank you all for listening today. Thanks, Ken Davis, for letting me drive his Chicago newsroom car. And go out there and whatever you do, whoever you're going to do it for, vote.